Okay, top tips on client interviewing, particularly in the area of succession. I'll link some materials on interviewing and client interviewing below, but in the context of succession law, here are my top 5 tips on how to become a better interviewer. Number 1, remember Rashomon. I don't know if you've seen Rashomon. You've probably seen a movie or TV episode that's been based on it. Rashomon's a story of a murder that's told from the point of view of several different people, including, I think, the ghost of the murdered man. And what it gets across is that idea of point of view, that everyone has a different point of view on the truth, and those point of views can tell very, very different stories. When it comes to client interviewing, we spend a lot of time in law talking about what the facts are. In reality, we never ever have facts that are that unproblematic. So bear that in mind, that anything you hear is that your client's point of view. You're probably never going to find out what the actual truth is of anything, but at least you're going to be able to present that particular client's point of view if you're aware of that. Okay, tip number 2, emotional intelligence. There's a lot of writing around emotional intelligence at the moment. It's a skill, and it's something you need to learn through practice. Being able to recognize the small signs of what people are saying, what their needs are, and what people are saying is usually quite different from what they mean. And sometimes I'll be putting out little cues to say, I want you to ask more, or I want you to do something, so I can tell my story in a slightly different way, or I'm deceiving you, or whatever. So it's one of those things that, again, you don't have to practice it through interviewing, but practicing those emotional intelligence skills can get you a long way to understand the difference between what the actual words that are being presented and the story that's going on underneath. 3, reframing. This is a technique that comes from mediation, and that's where you reframe what a client says in a logical, objective kind of way. Quite often, it's very good in conflicts when people say things that are really heated. It's a good idea for us in the succession context for several reasons. One is that we have to be absolutely certain that we've got people's client instructions correctly. So we can say, okay, what you're telling me is you would like to do the following, and present it to them, and then they can say yes or no. It also enables you to take some of the heat out of it. So people are often very upset, angry, traumatized, or whatever in client interviewing situations. And reframing can be a way of taking the heat out of something and presenting it. So if they have a screaming rant about how much they hate their son and want to cut them out of the will, and you can come back to them and say, okay, well, what I'm hearing from you is that your son will receive nothing in the will. It may not change their mind, but it may actually bring them back to the formal legal process of what we're actually doing here is not having a rant about our family. What we're doing is we're disposing of our assets. We're looking at our estate, and let's do it in a way that's calm and logical and so on. So reframing, take the heat out of it, put it back into a logical language. 4, keep notes. This is a good advice for anything in terms of law, but keep notes. Make sure you diarise any follow-ups that you need to make. Make sure you're very, very thorough in what you do, because these things will come back and haunt you later on. It can be very tempting just to jot notes down and say, oh, I'll fill them out later, but it is very, very important to make thorough notes at the time. Very, very important from succession point of view, because it can be a very long time between writing a will and either having to have the will administered, or even when someone comes back to you and says, remember that will that I wrote, I want to change it or create a codicil or whatever. So you will find that keeping very thorough notes are good for you, and are also good for people downstream from you, because that happens a lot in this area of law, that you may work on a particular client's interests, and you may not be the person who ends up dealing with it, or someone else may be the person who drafted the will, and then you're the one who ends up with it. So it's good practice to keep notes. And the last tip, I guess, is time is money. It can be relevant to remind clients that they're paying for your time, particularly when they're getting upset, particularly when they're unfocused, or they want to tell you about what cousin Jeff did to Aunt Myrtle at Christmas last year. And sometimes it can be a situation where you need to really remind people that they're paying for this time, and it's going to be very costly for them if you're going to hear the whole life history. Now that might sound harsh, and I know one advice I got in the area of family law, one of my lecturers said, give them a box of tissues and tell them to go outside and cry, and they can, when they come back, that when they're back on the clock, to be composed. And a lot of people thought that was a terrible thing to say, that as if if someone's crying you should be comforting them and whatever. And his response was that well, they're paying a lot more for your time as a lawyer than they would to pay a counsellor. And sometimes you need to remind people of that and say, and remind yourself that your role is not to be the best friend of your client. Your role is to be their lawyer, and that sometimes means saying, I cannot help you with this part. It will cost you a lot of money for me to do this. I really advise that you do, you vent somewhere else. You get all those emotions out. So I'm not saying be horrible to your clients by any means, but if someone is really upset, and they're going to have a half an hour rant or crying fit, do you really think that charging them billable hours is going to help them with that? Okay, so there's 5 tips. Remember rationing, think about emotional intelligence, reframe, keep good notes, and finally, remember that time is your client's money.